went to the police with this. And so I had enough courage to go and walk into the police station and sit down with the detective and tell him this story. That took a lot, because you have to be really confident in yourself and in your story and in what you've learned to actually walk into that police station, to drive 400 miles and walk into that police station and sit down across from that detective and tell him this story. And that's what I did. Yeah, that's what I did.
Been interested in unsolved crimes, especially murders of women and girls. It's just always been a passion of mine to research these cases and kind of hopefully help in some form or fashion. You know, I've never been dedicated to a case like Beverly's before. It's always been something that I'll read about, go to bed, and it won't cross my mind again for a couple weeks or months or years. But when I first found Beverly's case, it was kind of a nagging feeling. It kind of never left. It was always there, but of course, I'd had a baby in 2020. I was very busy, as you know, but it kind of never left my brain. So... But years go by and I'm still thinking of Beverly's case, and then I find the Legacy of Beverly Jarrow's Facebook page, and it just had a wealth of information, I didn't really find on the internet, at least not easily. So I was very thankful for Chuck and Kathy and everyone that run the page, to have all that information readily available to me so I could be up to speed, more than what I already was. And then I made, I met all of these amazing people, who want to get this case solved, who want justice for Beverly, for Carol, her sister, who's still alive. And it's just time. It's been 60 years. It's time. It's time for this case to be closed. It's time for Beverly to finally get the justice and peace, she deserves.
I'm guessing by now many of you are asking yourselves why I'm not talking about the usual suspects. I will answer that by saying that they're just not the focal point of this documentary. Although they all have their place in time, Daniel Schulte, Roger McNamara, Bruce Billick, John Palian, and Harry Joseph Madoll just do not align with all of Beverly's most occupied locations on a weekly basis. They all fall short at some point, and none of them can be connected to the fourth and final location that I will reveal by the end of this documentary. Yes, there is another location. Remember, this is 1964, and police detection was very different from today. They were limited by the lack of technology and relied on cruder tactics. In fact, I read that they brought James Mondzelewski back to the Jarrow's home and made him look at Beverly's crime scene, traumatizing an 18-year-old for life. I don't even know if that's legal, but that's what they supposedly did. At 11:30, Beverly decides to go home instead of directly going to Margie's house. She does this at Barb Klanowski's request. No matter what plans were discussed the night before, it wasn't until 11:30 that Beverly knew she was going home alone. Now that we know Beverly was actually at the bus stop at noon, is it possible that someone was watching her? Here is the corner of Dorothy and Turney, and if you look to your left, this would be where the bus stop is today, and I don't believe there's any reason for that bus stop to be different from 1964. It's right where that white postal truck is. What we really want to do is establish the fact that 9913 Greenview had a line of sight to that bus stop, and possibly our suspect could see her from their dormer window.
We're going to our second location, which is the firehouse. As you can clearly see, the distance from the back of the firehouse to Beverly's back door is a few seconds walk. Remember, gifts were left at the back door, and taking this path behind the firehouse to Beverly's back door would be ideal to go unseen, especially in the middle of the night or in the early morning. A fireman's 24-hour shift makes this as extremely easy as taking out the trash. Here is the side entrance of the firehouse from Dorothy. This looks nothing like it did in 1964. The new section building wasn't built yet. There was a field that the firemen would flood to make an ice rink for the winter. Here is an aerial view of that area in 1951. In this video, we're going to walk from behind the firehouse from McCracken all the way to the backyards in between the garages of Dorothy and McCracken. Obviously, this retaining wall would not have been there in 1964. It would have been just a field, and you could walk straight through to Dorothy Avenue. And as we get closer, we can see that at that time in '64, there weren't any fences, and you could walk straight through there. Obviously, this is way overgrown and hasn't been maintained, so it would have been much clearer and much easier to walk through there.
Now, this home behind the firehouse is a home that of a woman who was frequently visited by firemen. That's the rumor. I don't know how true it is, but it also was reported that rope was found there that was very similar to the rope that was found at the crime scene.
Back of the house, we're gonna, between the side door and the back door, we're gonna walk this way, and we're gonna, obviously the neighbors could see you, but just for a few seconds until you get to this area here, and then you could walk through the backyards behind the garage. That's where I'm going. This fence wouldn't have been here, and that fence wouldn't have been here, and you would have been right at the firehouse. So that's how quick it takes, 20 seconds.
Now, this is a diagram I posted on the Facebook group page of exit routes that could have been taken that day, and we could use them for a line of sight too. And as you can see, the green exit route would be Bruce's exit route, and the blue would be John, the neighborhood 18-year-old boy. The red is obviously the firehouse. All three of these for line of sight are not very good. They're not very good to see if Beverly's being dropped off by herself. You'd have to be there at the exact moment from Bruce's point of view, and it's very difficult, it's very narrow. Obviously, John's point of view is 0, and it's extremely difficult from the firehouse point of view. That's why the Stackowitz call is important, and we're going to go over that right now. The Stackowitz call is the phone call Beverly receives while at home between 12:30 and 1:30 p.m. Many have always assumed that the call came after Beverly talked to her mother about her great-grandmother's necklace. Otherwise, she would have mentioned the call to her mother. It's possible she just didn't mention the call, so we can say 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. No one in 60 years has come forward and said they were Stephen Stackowitz. Some say it was an out-of-state call or out-of-area call. The Jaros family states they don't know a Stephen Stackowitz. The police state it is a fake caller. This call tells us a few things if it is indeed the killer. Number one, Beverly doesn't know this person well enough to recognize his voice, even by disguising it. Number two, the caller is calling to see if any of the parents are home. Number three, the caller already knows Beverly is not with her sister Carol. Therefore, he saw her leave Mrs. Vannick's or saw her arrive on Thornton. Number four, the caller uses the name Stackowitz. No matter what anyone tells you, it's a popular name to the Garfield Heights area. There's just no Stephen Stackowitz. Number five, the caller or killer is close by, considering the call comes after Beverly talks to her mother. This call could have come as late as 1:15 to 1:30. Interestingly, I was reminded of this call on one of my last trips to Cleveland.
Before, and so I started looking over Facebook groups, and I came across the legacy of Beverly Jaros. After, researching many Facebook groups, I found that the legacy of Beverly Jaros seemed to me the most genuine, active Facebook page. So I requested to join, and I've met so many people, but in particular, John Ferrato. Him and I kind of formed this partnership when I realized he had an out-of-the-box theory about what could have happened in Beverly, and I thought, well, if it hasn't been solved after almost 60 years, it's probably going to take out-of-the-box thinking to really look at this from all angles. So 7 months ago when I met John, we kind of clicked, and it's the Lord guiding us. I don't know how else to explain that, but when you're waking up every day and you're thinking of Beverly and you're thinking of all the ways, you're looking at it from every angle, and, you're sleeping and breathing this case, and you're doing it with a partner, it makes it so much easier. But that's how I discovered Beverly's case. And I look at her picture and I don't know if I see myself, but I feel like I know her, even though I've never met her, but I feel connected to her in ways that I can't explain. I mean, I was a 16-year-old girl at one point, of course, but I look at her picture and I just feel obligated. Like, I feel like it's my job to help solve this. It's hard to explain, but I don't know any other way to explain it besides the good Lord pushing me and pushing John and, all of the people that have been involved in this every step of the way for us doing our research. But yeah, it's been a path forward in trying to find her killer for sure.
So right away, I felt like this would be a great platform for launching this theory, and I did it in increments and steps. I led up to it going very slow so they didn't ruffle any feathers, and I wanted people to understand this as it happened to me. And this is what this video is about. It's this documentary is about how this happened to me so that you can understand it, and it shows you why it became so compelling to me.
At this point, I was feeling very frustrated. I didn't know when Thomas lived on Royal Boulevard, or if he even worked for the fire department in 1964. I really needed that information. Then one morning I received a call from Scarlett. We had never spoke on the phone in person until that morning. She was so excited. She says, "You're not going to believe it. I have the roster from 1964, and Thomas is on it."
I was finally able to get a hold of Sandra, the administrative assistant at the Garfield Heights Fire Department, and she provided me the 1964 roster that had all of the firefighters' names and where they lived at in 1964. So that was one of the key pieces that we needed to really form our theory and really get going on our research and connecting the dots. So when I obtained that, I started looking at all the names on the list, and then it was, I feel like, a miracle just to get that list, because when I spoke with Kenneth via email, which is the fire department chief, he had basically mentioned like they didn't even keep records like that. It was just amazing that they even found it. So that was one of the first coincidences that I came across just in my path alone.
If you look at this list, you'll see Thomas listed at 2 separate addresses in 1964. We know where 13805 Royal Boulevard is. That's the street I grew up on. But where is 5627 East 126th Street? This is 5627 East 126th Street. It is located right across from the shrine at Marymount High School.
There's the school and the school parking lot, and the convent up on the hill, and the shrine right here where the girls would walk. And I don't know if this fence was here at the time, but you could walk, you see people walking there, they would walk home or walk to school. And right there is our suspect's apartment.
When I first found out that Thomas lived across from the high school, it gave me a sick feeling. It told me that this had been going on for a while, possibly as early as the fall of 1963. It wasn't until I took some video of this area that something kind of strange happened. I was there in Garfield Heights on the day I was going to see Detective Mark Minari. I had put it off all day and was really nervous. I was about to back out, so I went to the shrine, knelt down, and I prayed. I prayed that I was doing the right thing. I prayed that if this isn't right, then I'll just turn around and go home to Eastern PA. After I prayed, I got in my Jeep and I drove to the Justice Center to talk to Mark. When I pulled up to the building and saw the name Stackowitz on the very front, I knew I was doing the right thing. It was right where I was supposed to be.
That roster, and I started going down the list looking at the names. I started sending out letters, and before that, Kenneth, like I mentioned, the chief of the fire department, had given me Tim Conroy's name, and I reached out to Tim, and that was a great conversation. And Tim was telling me about the people he worked with and working with Tom. And
Tim Conroy is an interesting story. I wasn't going to use this in a documentary because it does involve one of our group members, but not in a bad way. No one is guilty of anything here. It's just a peculiar part of this story that is worth mentioning. It's another one of the coincidences, or breadcrumbs, if you will, that is always connecting to Thomas. Tim worked for Thomas in the 90s for a couple of years. He was referred to us by the fire chief. It turns out Tim Conroy married Bill Jaros' ex-wife, Beverly. Yes, Beverly Jaros. Tim works for Tom and marries a girl named Beverly Jaros. Tom was married to a woman named Beverly. It sounds like you can't make this up, but it's true.
I started personally sending out letters to the addresses that I thought they might live at. And I sent out multiple letters. And in particular, I had contacted Dave Murphy. Dave Murphy was an interesting case because he was one of the firefighters that were on the list from 1964. When I contacted him, his wife had picked up and he was in the background, but she had me on speaker. And I basically just called and said that I wanted to speak about, his time in Garfield Heights in 1964 and working with Tom and what Tom was like. And then he immediately knew after a couple of minutes that this was about Beverly Jaros, and Dave, and I quote, said, "I don't want to talk about that." And that was the end of that. And then I sent a letter to Dave basically, saying, can you please just tell me what you know? It's been 60 years. Tell me anything you can. And then he called me, but I was not able to answer the phone. And I called him back and left a voicemail, and I still haven't heard anything from him.
Just before I went to see Mark Minari, I was behind the firehouse, and Barb Gray pulled up to my vehicle. Now, Barb Gray is the woman who now owns the home on Thornton Avenue. We had a very nice chat, and she welcomed me to use her property to take photos and video. She told me about the psychic that the police brought to her home. She said the woman was there for 4 hours. The psychic claims the killer is still alive, and that Ted Charles' spirit still walks the home. Now, walking in to see Detective Mark Unari was, to me, the biggest thing I've ever done in my life. I was actually walking into the police department to talk about Beverly Jaros. Not in a million years would I have thought I would be doing this. I was nervous and scared, but determined. I've never doubted my story or my experience for a second. As long as I had God by my side, I knew everything would turn out okay. I presented him with the suspect I had. The hardest part was telling him this started with something a psychic said in a podcast. However, I did tell him that I would have found Thomas without the reference from the psychic's reading. It just would have taken me longer, but would eventually arrive at the same conclusion. I told him of how I tried to reach out to Shane Waters and was never responded to. I told him how Robert Sackett asked me some questions in another Facebook group. Robert Sackett was the chief of police who reopened the Jaros case. He was interested in my stepfather and his brother being police officers from Garfield Heights. I told him who my suspect was. He responded by saying, "I don't remember a fire captain named Tom." All in all, we had a decent conversation. Although I caught him daydreaming a couple of times, I figured he's heard 1,000 stories from people who think they know who did it. Scarlett and I still email Mark everything we discover of interest in this case. I asked Mark about Detective Horrigan never telling who called every December 28th. Mark said no, he did tell who it was. One thing is we've asked Mark by email if Thomas was working that day of December 28th, 1964. Just a yes or no answer would do. We assume the police have a file of all the fireworkers who worked that day and what their shift was. We received no response. I want to touch on the Shane Waters podcast because it was a very frustrating time for me in 2021. I first must say Shane had some really good interviews with Carol Bartos and Detective Carl Begecki. Really informative. And his timeline was the most accurate to be found on the internet. I did find it very leading in that it was clear that his whole podcast suspect was Harry Joseph Madoff. Even the psychic was leading towards Harry. Harry Madoff was a teenage boy who 3 weeks after Beverly's murder was arrested for attempted murder of an Elyria woman. He apparently stabbed the woman. He was questioned by the Garfield Heights police, and under interrogation, he confessed to Beverly's murder. He later recanted his confession. His testimony was totally inaccurate, and police released him. In Shane's final episode, he asked the audience if anyone knows who Tom is or the number 99 that the psychic referred to, and to contact him. I did exactly that. I contacted Shane and told him who Tom was and the number 99 in full detail. His response was this. I wrote 2 more letters to Shane, and he never responded. And thank God for people like Scarlett who took the time to listen, or this documentary would never exist. After several comments on Shane's YouTube Foul Play podcast were made by me, he eventually took the podcast down off of YouTube.
I also spoke with Brian, who was the union president at the Garfield Heights Fire Department. And it was I started out, wanting to see if they had old photos of the fire department from around 1964, because John and I wanted to kind of get a visual of what the fire department looked like on the inside, firefighters around the fire truck, anything we could get a hold of. And before I'd even mentioned what I was looking for, he had pieced together that I was investigating Beverly's case. Because if you mention Garfield Heights in 1964, that kind of seems to be the first thought that people think of. So when he figured that out, and he had heard people, I guess around the fire department, were kind of talking about how somebody was calling and getting interested in the Beverly Jaros case, I guess it kind of got around that I was looking for old photos and things like that. But then people started not wanting to talk to me. Tim, like I said, Tim never called me back. Dave got he seemed to be a little upset when we talked on the phone. I was able to get a hold of the adopted son of Tom, and I had a lovely conversation with him, and I wanted to hear about his childhood and how he grew up, and what Tom was like working. And something I found very interesting, I asked him, the adopted son, I asked him, what was Tom's work like? Did he ever talk about his job? Tom worked, he retired after 35 years and eventually was a fire chief and retired after 35 years. What were some of the stories he told you? I'm sure he had a lot of cool ones. But the only thing that Tom ever mentioned to him was an incident involving a Camaro, I believe. But he never talked about the most notorious murder that Tom, I'm sure, would have either been working that day or would have been very close by, because he was a firefighter in 1964, in December of 1964. So if he wasn't working that day, he definitely would have been at the fire station or at home, which would have been just a few blocks over from the fire station. So I thought it was very peculiar about how he never mentioned the murder of Beverly Jarrows to his, adopted son. Even when the son grew up, and became an adult, how he, as he got older, and how Tom never mentioned Beverly's murder. And I feel like that is something you would definitely talk about if you wanted to talk about your job, and things that have happened over the years. And that's another thing too with his second wife, who also was named Beverly, how in the 24 years they were married, that was one of the reasons they got divorced, because of a lack of communication, and how Tom would never talk about his past.
Talking to Thomas's stepson was one of the last things we did, but it was inevitable. There were so many questions we had. One, was he Thomas's biological son? Thomas has no surviving biological line. His brother never had children, and Thomas never had any surviving children. His biological son died at 1 year old in 1970. For DNA purposes, he has very little, if none at all. And number two, it always was a question that I had. Did Thomas ever talk about December 28, 1964 to his wife Beverly of 24 years? They were married in 1972, and in 24 years of marriage, she has no recollection of Beverly Jarrows or Thomas mentioning that day. Thomas's stepson was very forthcoming. We told him we were investigating the murder of Beverly Jarrows and that his father worked at the firehouse at that time. We never tried to trick him into a conversation. He sounded like he loved his father and his childhood hanging around the firehouse. He's a very nice man.